Since the beginning of Season 8, LCK and Korean teams in general have just been looking a little bit lackluster. And this is especially true when you look at their international performance as well too. When you look strictly at LCK, it's kind of astonishing to see some teams that have risen to the top because the old guard just can't seem to function in terms of how they want to play the game, particularly with SKT or with Gen G. And now you have a team like Griffin, which is rising strongly to the top really quickly. And against all these old legacy names that you know that are actually great historic players. Now, why does Korea suck this Worlds? That's the big question. They've been knocked out of quarterfinals. This is the first time ever. This is also the first time ever that all the Korean teams haven't made it out of groups, and so Gen G had bombed going 1-5. So this is a anomaly, it seems. Well, actually it's because of the meta. The Korean meta has always been about slow pace, and there have been relatively few LCK teams that play fast paced and primarily for the early game. The big pain or big sore for LCK itself and all of their teams and their play style, when you break it down to its fundamental core of how they play the game and their philosophy, is that they go for the most logical play. They are far too logical when it comes to playing the game, and this has hindered them severely in Season 8. And this leads to being quite predictable when you see a Korean team play. It's because they're going for these high percentage plays, and they refuse to do a lower percentage play, something like a 50-50. They just absolutely will not do unless they must. And so this has led to them playing this more logical style, and they haven't been able to get out of that specific rut or that specific mindset. And so there are no crazy level ones like you see in the West from teams like Fnatic or CLG or G2. You just don't really see that a whole lot within LCK. And not only that, but they don't really play off meta picks. It's all about adhering to the meta strictly. And the reason for this is because, well, the meta is statistically the best chance to win due to the stats that the meta champions have. That's why they're meta, is because this is generally why a champion is meta, because it's just a stat based thing. If it has better stats, okay, well then that's what you play. And that can also be dependent upon maybe items, like looking at Ginsu's blade, for instance. So you have this strict adherence to the meta, and there are really no off meta picks unless you happen to have that from a previous solo queue pick. And that's not even in terms of you practicing it in solo queue. You don't even get a chance to really practice it in solo queue because you must practice the meta champions, or else your coach is probably going to be pissed at you, right? So then it comes from their previous time of when they weren't a professional player. A lot of these LCK players have these pocket picks that are off meta because that's what they had before they became pro. So they can always fall back onto that if the coach allows it, right? And so this all goes back to their play style of having the most logical play style possible. And that has entirely ruined them in this summer split and then heading into Worlds itself. Now, the biggest and most crucial, most disastrous thing that has happened to LCK was the removal of Tracker's Knife at the beginning of Season 8. This made it to where there was way less vision on the map, and that means that there's more inherent risk, right? That means that you have to make plays based on a much more limited amount of information, and that goes back to the whole idea of what I was talking about with logical play. Is that, well, if it's a lower percentage play, I'm not going to go for it. But the only reason why it's a lower percentage now is because there's a lack of vision. And so there's just inherently a lack of vision for tracker's knife removal, which also means that during the early game, your jungler can't set up vision for your laners to be safe. And then towards the mid game, it's also to where that you can't fully secure two objectives at the same time. It's pretty much impossible to do that. So instead, you have to focus on one specific objective and then plant your vision around that, and then take that objective instead of having multiple options of different objectives that you really want across the map that then get their risk lowered because you have vision in order to fight against potential, getting caught out, right? And then there's also the factor that there are more ways to deny vision now than ever before. The control wards, right? It's that, yeah, you can only place one per person at any time on the map. Of course, you can have 3 in the inventory. So that there's like little ways around working around only having one control ward per person, right? Because you just then move your vision sporadically around wherever you think there are enemy green wards. Well, that in itself is the ability to deny vision when vision, there isn't a whole lot of vision anyways. There are less green wards on the map in the entire first place. So now you have control wards in which are dictating exactly where vision pockets are and where they aren't, more specifically. And then also there's the sweeper, which usually clears more than one ward. So if you have a sweeper that can now clear at least 2 wards minimum, and then you have less wards in the beginning anyways, suddenly the amount of vision denial that you can do is astronomical. And so it develops this choke style, which a lot of top teams have, which make plays easier mid-game, meaning that the team doesn't go on forever the game doesn't go on forever due to the losing side still being able to place vision because of sight stones or tracker's knife, right? There's not as much of a way back in the game, in the vision game, because there are just less wards that you can place now. So there are more ways to contest vision, but there is no more ways to put down vision itself. And so without vision, now you must gamble, and that creates more variance from game to game. That means that the wards that you place, you have to specifically place them at certain times of when you think the jungler is coming around, because otherwise you aren't going to have vision for this certain amount of time, and maybe that's when the enemy jungler is trying to gank you. Well, then you're never going to know at that moment. So you have to place it around jungle timings and what camps you think that the enemy jungler is taking. So there's just a ton more variance within the game now, and that's why these Western teams are doing better. It's not because of the inherent variance of just like, oh, well, this Western team got lucky. Like, no, it's not that necessarily. There's a little bit of truth to that, but it's also that the Korean teams have just been playing this control style for a very long time. And since the game is more risky, early game picks are way more rewarding. With early game power spikes being king, you have these now meta champions. Before they weren't, because we didn't really know how to hone in on the play style. And this is one of the latest times I can really think of to where the meta is just now being ultimately established, to where you have to play this fast-paced game to where there's more lane aggression and there's more jungle ganks and there's just more early game stuff going on. So that means now that you have more champion picks which are based around early game power spikes, because they're far more important. You know, 1 item power spike or 2 item power spikes are very important now, because the game is just so much more fast paced. You can do vision denial better as well too. So that means if you get control of the early game, then you will be in control of the mid game, most likely if you do your due diligence and you do vision clearing properly. So this is the first time that Korea has ultimately just failed to adapt, because this game mechanic has always been in the game since the very beginning of its creation. Vision has always been a massive part of the meta, whether that was green wards and, supports being strictly ward bots, to, Sightstone, to limiting the amount of wards a single person can place, to now the removal of Tracker's Knife. The game has slowly removed vision options from the game, and Korea's fundamental theory of calculated play is no longer sustainable in the utmost fullest sense.